Welcome to the Melodology Podcast, celebrating the unsung excellence of melody makers. My name is Arthur Breur. I am a melody maker and I am your host. And I am joined today by a video game composer and a double bassist. And his name is Caeden Brusett. Welcome to the Melodology Podcast, Caeden.
Thanks, Arthur. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So I met you right here in Portland. So it might not look like it, but we're both in the same time zone. We're both generally in the same place. But I don't know how to do a podcast with the other person in the same room. So we're still doing the podcast using Riverside FM remotely, which is a whole lot of fun and makes it easier for everybody. So, Caden, welcome and tell us a little bit about your background in music.
Yeah, I graduated from Oberlin Conservatory with a degree in bass and with a lot of composition experience out there. I grew up with music. My dad is a songwriter by hobby, and there was a lot of singing, playing of music in my house growing up. And that's sort of just how it kept going.
What are your earliest memories that you can think of in terms of songs or music?
My earliest memory would be my mother singing to me while she rocked me to sleep, and then my earliest memory of me having a moving personal experience with music was playing notes and chords when I was, like, 6 or 7 on an old electronic, like, Casio keyboard, very old, very cheap, and I was playing just some notes on it in the late evening by myself and was just incredibly moved by whatever I was playing.
Well, that's an experience I think probably a lot of composers and a lot of instrumentalists can relate to, just the idea of creating these sounds kind of out of nowhere and relating to them and having emotional reaction to them. That's absolutely something that I can relate to, and I feel like that's how music kind of works in the first place. If it's a new song that you've never heard before or a new work that you've never heard the music before, it is that same, okay, it's a new exciting experience. And the whole point of music, this crazy magical experience, is that it affects us emotionally beyond our control.
Yeah, and as a composer, one of the most exciting and frustrating parts of it is when I play something and I feel incredibly moved and I go, "What was that? What just happened?" And I have
This
to
is
go
why
back
you
and figure it
always
out.
have record on. You always record yourself while you're doing stuff.
I have been damned so many times because I was just toying around
Yeah.
and I forgot to do it.
I've actually gone back and found tape cassette recordings from a long, long time ago. For those of us, for those of you listening who even know what a cassette is, a lot of times I did record myself just improvising, and I have all this music that I discovered on cassette that I'm like, I this isn't me performing something. This is me just improvising and coming up with a melody and then turning it into a song. And I never wrote it down. And I've recovered pieces of music that I wrote that way.
Wow.
Would you consider when you're composing? What do you consider your influences? What things do inspire you, and what things do you feel you draw some influence from?
Among film composers, I really love the works by John Powell. I've loved him for a long, long time. Like, when I was a kid listening to How to Train Your Dragon for the first time and how well orchestrated all that was, it blew my mind. And as I've gotten older, I've also really appreciated Dario Marianelli. Um, his tracks are very emotional, also very well orchestrated, and there's kind of like a sophistication to them. I strive to write things like him.
I think it's kind of frustrating for me and kind of sad sometimes to note that every television production, every TV show, almost without exception, there are a few exceptions, but every TV show that has a plot, any kind of production that has characters and story in it, has music behind it. And there is somebody who created that music. There's somebody who composed that music. And there are so many names of so many people out there creating music. And of course, with video games, if you're playing a video game, there's music behind the video game most of the time. that puts you in the mood, that carries you through the story, that has, characters and things like that in it as well. So it's this ubiquitous thing. It's around us all the time, but most of the time, we're not thinking about the fact that somebody spent hours creating the music that's behind what we're viewing.
It's very funny how someone can be so good and so well known for not being noticed.
Right. Well, and I think the better they are, the less they get noticed, at least while you're watching the show.
Mhm.
And I still feel personally that the better somebody is, the more you can just not notice them during the performance and during the show that you're watching, but the more you are brought back into the story when you hear the music separate from the show. That's, for example, John Powell, How to Train Your Dragon score. You listen to that music and you feel like you're flying again. You feel like you're in that scene when you're way up in the sky with the dragon, and it's just remarkable how it takes you back in your mind back to the scenes that you've watched.
Yeah, even having been in working in music for quite some time now, it's always surprising how effective music is at transporting you to different places.
So, what in terms of music as a bassist, what's your favorite music to play along to for the experience of both playing and listening to the music at the same time?
Well, now you're adding in a whole bunch of other mixtures of factors, but Brahms always super fun because what people might not know is as a bassist, we're not necessarily noticed very much until we're not there. And a large part of our musical function is to just be in the background supporting things. But if you're just playing like 1 5 1 5 bum 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 bum, if you do that forever, it gets pretty boring, especially when you practice hours and hours and hours to gain proficiency on an instrument. It's quite cumbersome. So when composers write music that is actually technically challenging or even melodic, it makes us very happy because we actually have something to play. So Brahms wrote really fun bass parts. I'm also big partial to some Beethoven. Beethoven really gave us the cello part, but Beethoven wrote good cello parts. Those are pretty fun too. I'm also a sucker for Berlioz's Symphonie Fantastique.
Mm,
That has a great bass part. And in terms of other composers I just really enjoy listening to, I love Tchaikovsky. Prokofiev is beautiful.
mhm.
I prepared a presentation to talk about the shawl dance from one of Prokofiev's ballets. And if you want beautiful melodies, beautiful orchestration, go to Prokofiev's ballets. Wonderful stuff.
For listeners who might not be familiar with orchestra and with orchestration, a lot of the history of the bass is it was just intended to add weight to the cello part. It is literally, it would just double the cello part an octave down to make there be a much thicker, deeper sound to the whole orchestra. And that really, I don't completely know the history of how it worked, but that was really very much the case until the 1700s and 1800s, until finally the bass started to get some attention on its own. And I believe even with Beethoven in his Fifth Symphony, he provided this really fast running part of the symphony where the basses come in very, very quickly at the beginning of sort of a fuguetta, sort of a section where they play something and then the cellos come in and play the same thing. And then, it kind of goes through the different sections of the orchestra. And at the time, the bassists kind of rebelled and said, "This isn't playable. We can't do this." And Beethoven said something along the lines of, "I'm Beethoven. Yes, you can. You will. Whether you like it or not." Or maybe he said, "You will, and you'll like it." But it wasn't really considered solo instrument. It was considered very much support instrument.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's largely because of a number of factors. Basses were not standardized back then. So even to like the number of strings that we had, be
Mm.
anywhere from like 3 to like 6 strings based on instruments. And also our setups were not very good. The bassist was hard to play. It was hard to play things well, and therefore it meant that the players did not sound very good most of the time. In that specific case with Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, there was actually a bass virtuoso in the orchestra that Beethoven knew was there. And so when he was writing out this fast part in the scherzo or trio, I guess, he actually knew that this virtuoso was there and that the virtuoso could probably handle it. And so that's why he felt comfortable giving it to the bass section.
Mhm. So everybody else had to come up to his level.
Basically, yeah. And nowadays, the hardware has gotten more effective, if not necessarily more standardized. In the US, we usually play with four strings, but you still see some five-string basses around. And the playing has just gotten better. The technique, the pedagogy has just developed to a point where now we're beginning to have a more soloist approach to the bass, and we have lots of more virtuosos now. So we're sort of up and coming in the world.
Well, that sort of brings us to today's melody, which you introduced me to this melody because I was not familiar with it. It's specifically a melody for bass. It is from Verdi's opera Otello. So we have our first opera entry into the podcast. Even though it's not an aria from an opera or something like that, we have our first opera entry with a bass solo from Verdi's opera Otello. Tell us about this particular spot in Otello and this particular bass solo.
Yeah, so the solo takes place in Act 4. And essentially, for those who have not read the story or seen the opera, spoilers, basically, Otello, this general, has been tricked to believe that his wife, Desdemona, who is his world, has been unfaithful to him. And he is so wrapped up in his grief, his anguish, and it turns to rage. And he concludes that he's going to kill her. It's Shakespeare. It's, we'll skip over the wow, that's rough, buddy part of it, but he concludes that he's going to kill his wife. And this scene is bass solo, so it's the whole section playing, and it is describing, it is supporting Otello creeping into Desdemona's chambers in order to prepare to kill her. And it is very haunting, and it is almost entirely just the bass section the whole time. The high strings come in with a couple of answers in the breaks here, but it is perfect for October, very spooky.
Is there anything else in terms of the solo itself, any background on it or anything history-wise that you know about it that you can share?
So I've heard two stories in my studies as a bassist. One I don't think is very true, but kind of funny, and the other one I think is more true. I'll say the untrue one first. This was written by Verdi, and one reason I was told Verdi gave this solo to the bass section. Now, this I believe is not true, is because the bassists back then struggled so well to play anything in tune that he figured if he gave them a melody, they would play it out of tune and so it'd be extra discordant and therefore extra spooky, which
Okay.
is pretty hard to hear as a bassist. But thankfully, I don't think that's true because actually, similarly to Beethoven, in Verdi's orchestra, there was a pretty renowned bass soloist named Bottesini, who was the principal of the section. And Bottesini unequivocally could really play the bass. So the other story is that Verdi gave the section this solo, and then in rehearsal, the section butchered it so bad that Verdi had to fire everybody else except Bottesini, the principal, and rehire a new section.
Oh, harsh.
Yeah, it's pretty. pretty brutal to have been potentially on the premiere of this piece with a bass solo and then to be cut from it. And then a couple other things to note about the piece itself. It'd be played by anywhere from nowadays like 4 to 8 basses. In the part in modern editions now, it'll call for it to be muted. So on our instruments, we actually can put a mute on, which will kind of dampen the sound. It's funny how it works, but basically the body of the bass sound will sound the same, but then almost like it pulls back some of the resonance. So it makes it a little bit more focused and a little bit more dense. I guess like sits heavier. But it's a great solo.
Opera at the time was the source of entertainment. And it had its own background score in situations very much like this, where this is a background to something happening on the stage without anybody singing along to anything. There's no information that's being shared by somebody. This is scoring to the scene. And as is often the case, sort of as a trope of musical composition for films, when something is scary or something is suspicious, it will be the low sounds that you hear. Low sounds, low frequencies tend to give us reactions that are primal and sometimes fearful reactions. And I've heard that this is along the lines of if you heard a lion or a tiger growling in the jungle, if you heard some large animal, it would be making a large rumbling sound. So that low growling sound is sort of a warning, threatening sound in terms of our biological evolutionary background. And therefore, that's why it works to add to a tense or scary moment in a background of a story like this. What's essentially providing the underscore of a scene.
That's actually very funny. I hadn't made that connection myself. It actually is very funny because the bass part actually opens with just a long held low note. And for us, we are very conditioned with to be familiar with this dark sound to spooky because we can see movies. Hundreds of scary horror movies out there that have spooky soundtracks. But I think it's funny to think about people from this time, they listen to operas and this is how they get their entertainment. Probably they did not hear a lot of solos from the bass section.
Mm.
So if you're someone in the audience, all of a sudden you hear this low, dark, spooky sound from an instrument you're not even necessarily really sure that you've heard. So it's this new sound coming out of the opera pit, but it's a new instrument you've never heard of making a scary sound, while the protagonist of this tragedy comes on stage and begins to enter the room of his wife, who has supposedly been cheating on him. It would be pretty haunting.
I would think so. Anything else you'd like to say about the melody before we take a break and then come back and take a look at it?
No, I think we've covered it pretty well.
All right. We will be right back and we will take a look at the bass solo from Verdi's Otello, Act IV. Welcome back to the Melodology Podcast, celebrating the unsung excellence of melody makers. I am your host, Arthur Breur. I am here with composer and bassist Caeden Brusett, and we are looking at the bass solo from Verdi's opera Otello in the fourth act, when Otello is about to go into Desdemona's room and possibly kill her. So here we go. We're going to just walk along this melody as if we have never seen it before or ever heard it before and see what it is that we hear and what it is that we notice in the piece as we are going along. By the way, I am using Muse Score for the sheet music for this, and I am using the Muse Score bass sounds for this, and it's a big bass sound. So here we go. What are you noticing so far, other than the fact that I do have the metronome playing along as well, which would not be in the actual performance? I just put the metronome in because if you don't have that, you've just got this long note and you don't necessarily know how long something is. So what are we noticing so far?
Well, the first thing I notice is that it starts out with one long note, which to me as a composer is a beautiful way to just set a scene and a
Mhm.
tone. Because if you just picture Otello walking into the room and just this low, quiet sound, just a rumble, it immediately sets up the rest of the scene.
What I'm curious about here is it's an ominous scene, but this is outlining a major chord and a major scale. Even though it's low and creepy, it's not totally a trope where it's minor music and so forth. I don't know what the background is, but I'm curious what music has played just before this because I noticed that the key signature is in A flat, and this first chord that's being outlined is a half step up from the fifth of the scale, starting there. So I'm kind of curious how the key fits in. But yeah, for a song melody, to have a very long starting note is uncommon. It does follow other rules. I mean, it's going up by very small intervals. It's going up by thirds and then just a second. It doesn't have big leaps. It is staying on a chord, so you know those chords, those notes in that chord. If somebody were to be singing it, it would be understandable. So somebody listening to this is going to hear that that is a major chord being outlined, especially because the bottom note of that chord has been given so much prominence right there with that long held note.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think part of what makes this not sound quite so major E is that the long note is actually so long. It does solidify us in E, but to me, it does something when I hear it where the majorness and I think the low quality of the basses darkens the sound enough where it almost sounds major, but there's another element to it that darkens it and twists it slightly.
Hmm. Yeah. The other thing that I'm noticing is just in terms of patterns, we have a long held note and then we jump up two notes. We have two leaps and then a step back down. So we've got this kind of an arcing shape to the melody so far. I'm going to play just that part again. So yeah, so we have this up and down sound, deep, sort of ominous sound, even with it being a major chord.
Yeah, and I think it would sound more major to me as a phrase if it didn't go up to the C sharp. So the bum bottom. I think that just like drives a knife in just a little bit where it feels slightly like bittersweet.
Hmm. All right, well, let's go ahead and continue on to the second phrase of this melody and see what happens there. So what have we got?
So in this one, whereas in the first phrase it goes up by thirds,
Mhm.
this one we're actually doing more going up by fifths and fourths. So the intervals are getting bigger while still in the same shape. It's more of a development of the melody.
Yeah, we're still outlining an E major chord, but we've gone 1 5 1 and then leapt all the way up to the fourth of the scale and come back down to the third. So we still have this big E major chord, but we've stretched it out over an octave and a half instead of just kind of sitting on half of the octave, as it were.
Yeah, it's expanding out, and unlike before where it's B to C sharp, which is very close, it's a second, we're jumping up a fourth, which sort of makes it more expressive.
Yeah. Well, it's an octave and a fourth too. So it's leapt a huge distance from where it started. It's the same rhythmic pattern and it's the same general arcing shape, although in this case, it's not coming back to the third note. It's going higher still as it gets to that G sharp.
Yeah, and from an orchestration standpoint, the low part of a bass is very muddy. Across distances, it can be. And so, what this is doing effectively is it introduces us to the melody and then is quickly getting us to higher registers where then the bass can project. clearly.
Hmm. Something else I would point out on this. So, for people who are unfamiliar with the instrument, the standard bass now is built with four strings, and those strings are E, A, D, and G. So, the fact that this is in E flat, if you were just nowadays using a standard bass, you couldn't play that E flat without adding a string extension because it's just not possible. The lowest note that you can play on a bass is that E. So that almost also seems like, and I don't know how standard the basses were in Verdi's time, but that right there, it's the lowest note you can possibly play on the instrument. It's also not necessarily a note that you can do anything with as far as vibrato or kind of giving that note any kind of emotion because you're just playing the raw open string down there and it's going to resonate because it is that lowest string. You're not putting a finger down to shorten the string in any way. It's the lowest string just playing out.
Yeah, nowadays we do have some techniques where you can actually vibrate an open string
Mm,
by vibrating other parts of the instrument, but probably back then when they were writing it, they were not necessarily thinking about it like that.
mm. But that also to me answers potentially why is the E the lowest note instead of it being E flat. That's a possibility, but it's yeah, you've basically got as low as you can go on the instrument.
And also, in terms of how this is getting kind of in the weeds here, but with how the strings are tuned, they respond to each other because they're all tuned to the same instrument. And so different notes on the bass will be more resonant naturally than others because other strings will respond sympathetically.
Mhm.
And so, since we are in this key, this works well with E string, the A string, some of the D string. So these notes are going to be pretty resonant currently in the bass. But
Oh
as
yeah.
we'll see, it's going to change a little bit.
Let me point out for folks who are maybe not familiar with a little bit of music theory and a little bit of the physics of music. If you take one string and you make it have one arc of vibration, that's the lowest, that's the primary note that that string plays. But if you make that note into you have two waves across that string, basically you kind of hold, just barely touch it in the middle. So when it vibrates, it has to vibrate in exactly two waves instead of in just one big long wave. It can't vibrate in anything except a solid number of waves, one, two, three, four, five, because if it's a partial, if it's like a fraction of a wave, then the end of the string would have to be waving, and the ends of the strings are stuck. They're attached to the instruments. So the end of the string doesn't move anywhere, but then the string can vibrate, and it can vibrate in one wave, it can vibrate in two waves, it can vibrate in three waves. And so if it's if it's vibrating in two, that's an octave up. It's the same note, but one octave higher in pitch, but it's exactly the same note. So playing an E an octave up while you're on a bass is going to make that low E vibrate as well. It's just part of the physics of music, as well as that high G sharp. That's also going to resonate in that low E string. So yeah, this is all part of the way that the math of music works, why particular notes sound the way they do. This is kind of like advanced composition and advanced arranging technique to be aware of how an instrument is going to vibrate when you are actually playing the other strings on that instrument.
Yeah, it can be a lot to wrap your head around, especially if you don't have a background in string instruments or sort of advanced music theory, I guess, or how music works fundamentally. But an easy way to think about it, if you're kind of lost talking about wavelengths and ratios and fractions of it all, is the simplest answer is if you look at a stringed instrument, a string is tightened to a certain point, and basically just know that strings are like treasure chests where there are multiple notes in one string, even when you pluck it, based on how strings ring and how frequencies work. There are multiple notes actually happening at the same time, and you can activate those separate notes using special techniques.
All right. Let's just go ahead and keep moving along here. I'm going to go back to the beginning and then we will play a little farther along through this melody. I'm not quite sure where I'll stop, but let's play along and see what we get to. we have this kind of fake out that comes along. First of all, we don't get a nice long note again. We just get notes that are moving very quickly, still going in what is essentially an E major chord and an E major scale, but then it starts to kind of go off the rails in terms of exactly where it is and what key it's in and so forth, looking at the music. And for those of you who are listening to the podcast, if you want to watch this on video, it is on our Patreon. You can support the podcast by being a Patreon patron, and you can see the videos from the podcast. But we have what's called some enharmonic notes happening. If you're thinking in terms of a piano keyboard, the white notes, so in this case we get up to a D, and it's a D sharp. Well, D is one of the white notes, and if you go half step up, you get D sharp, which is one of the black notes. But if you go on E, which is a whole step up from D, and you take an E flat, you're going down a half step to exactly the same key on the piano. So it's exactly the same note in terms of what the pitch is supposed to be, but it's functionally kind of different because E and E flat are two different keys, D and E are two different notes. So raising one of them up or lowering one of them down technically just changes how it fits into the overall scale. What are you seeing in this spot now that we've moved past those two long opening phrases?
The first thing I notice here is this continuation after the opening phrases is actually the exact same notes as the original first phrase. You have an E to a G sharp to a B natural and then a C sharp. It's exactly the same, just going to be an octave up. But then the fake out comes from instead of it just coming back down like it did in the beginning, it goes up a whole step to a D sharp.
All right, let me just play that spot right there. Yeah, it's been a fake out. We've had these situations where every time it has gone up a little bit and then come back down. And now it's not exactly the same thing as happened before.
Absolutely. And the enharmonic note that happens actually comes from the D sharp in that measure that we ended on becomes an E flat. And it also introduces the shortest notes that we've heard so far. Those E flats are bum, 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 which are going to be eighth notes. And those begin to sort of drive us to the next downbeat. Here we're actually getting into more of like an E flat minor key, which is lots of flats. It's flats as far as you can see. And going from E natural, which is four sharps, we're basically swinging hard the other direction. If you think about in sort of in a meta way, sounds being like sharps are brightening things, raising them up. Flat is lowering and darkening everything down. And for me, when I think about this, I sort of think about it as almost a commentary on Otello's mind and his decision making. Because in this scene, there's no talking. It is just Otello quietly walking through a room, going to a desk, maybe grabbing a sword, and snuffing out a candle. That's all that happens.
Hmm.
So here it's just imagine this is Otello talking, and these cues of an enharmonic note is a classic compositional way for the composer to put a big red flag that something's happening here. And it's important for us to look at that as a way of, oh, here something is changing. And if we look at it as it being Otello's mind, Otello's mindset is beginning to change.
Hmm. We also end up with 16th notes in that next measure after that in measure 9 and in measure 10. And this kind of gradually lowering line that brings us back down towards the middle range of the middle of the clef there. And looking at it, it doesn't seem like too much stuff is going on. But I want to point out we started with a very, very solid E. And whether or not somebody listening to this can recognize the fact or not, because most people don't have perfect pitch, but people do react to pitches whether they know it or not. And in this case, we come all the way back down to an E flat and land on the E flat. And that last note in the phrase is an E flat. I'm going to go ahead and play just those last notes. Now, that might sound to somebody listening to the piece as if that's a leading tone that's going to be leading back up to E, but it might also just sound like it's landed someplace. And here's where we started, and here's where we are now. So we've gone up a major seventh, but in a scale, if they were actually in the A flat major scale, we're on the fifth of the scale there. But who knows where we functionally are right now because we're not sitting any place where we really have been in the rest of the piece.
Yeah, and even in terms of register, if you think about it, we start from the lowest note on the bass, and then this little melody with the E flats is actually about 2 octaves above that. And I also want to point out we have the 16th notes here, and they sort of ba da 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 dum. It almost has this the contour of it as it goes down and then it comes up again. And with the 16th note, it almost like we fall faster and then sort of drag our way up into this big leap into the next those notes of that measure.
It does do a nice job of kind of creeping.
Yeah, it slowly comes along. And I also mentioned with the last couple of notes, it's very interesting. The last 3 notes in the original score, there is a note on there that says morendo, which means to die away. So you get from at that point, it's very, very quiet. There's almost as quiet as you can go for this time. And it then still says die away.
And I do want to point out, enharmonically, those last four notes are as if you're on an E major scale because it's A flat and F flat. F and E don't have a half step between them, they're a half step apart. So F flat is the same as E. So A flat is the same as G sharp. So we're still playing something that sounds to the ear as if it's part of the E major chord, and the previous measure has C flat, and there's no half step between C and B. So a C flat is a B, which is the fifth of the scale. So it's kind of still outlining that scale, but to land on the seventh of the scale, if that's what it's supposed to be, is definitely kind of a we're in a new spot right there. We're not in that solid foundation area. And we've arced all the way up to more than 2 octaves above where we started and coming back down so that those high notes give us tension, definitely give us tension.
Yeah, and I love what you said about we started on a low E natural and we're now resolving to an E flat. And I love what you said about we are now way away from our normal harmonic foundation in this piece. We are miles ahead. You might think, oh, it's E natural to E flat. That's only a half step down. But it's actually funny in music like that. There's actually fewer relationships between notes that are closer together like that. If you were to
Mhm.
modulate by like change keys to a key that's like a fourth away, you're going to have notes that actually are going to overlap because they're kind of similar. But if it's a half step, immediately the similarities go far away because harmonically the notes of those keys are going to be different.
Yeah. And as a way to visualize that, think in terms of if you're taking a string, then this is the way bass, the stringed instruments all work. You put your finger down on a string and you're shortening the string. So you're making the vibrations all a little bit shorter. And those vibrations then are all just a fraction shorter than the string was in the first place. For each time you bring your finger a little bit farther along the string, it gradually makes those notes shorter and shorter. When your finger is really close to the end of the string, all of the different vibrations of that string are just a little bit off from the primary vibrations of the string. So if you think of it in those terms, it becomes kind of obvious. You just shifted things a little bit, but everything is just a little bit out of alignment. And that misalignment is audible, and it's also something that structurally in music, it's gonna be a challenge to get from that spot to a spot, that's back to where you were in the first place.
Yeah, and I also want to point out in terms of the function of the basses in this moment, as we're getting into this more E flat minor world, farther away from the E naturals, we're getting into notes and relationships of notes that, like we talked about before, the bass responds well to an E like E major key because the other strings like it. We're getting into notes that have less relationships with how the bass is currently normally tuned. And so the sound of the bass is going to get slightly more muted, a little more pressed, and just the color will be a little different.
It physically is literally more tension on the instrument. The higher the notes are, the more tension there likely is, and when you're going higher notes by putting your finger on a string and shortening it, you're adding tension to that string. So literally, it's not even just a figurative thing. There is more tension in the notes and in the instrument itself in that the higher ranges. So let's go ahead and continue on. I'm gonna go ahead and play the eighth notes leading into that, the N harmonic E flat at this point, leading into that phrase that went up and back down. And then we're gonna continue on for a few more measures after that. So I went a little farther than I planned to on that. Let's just go back and look at those two phrases where it has the short notes into a phrase after. So these measures here. On that one, the first thing that I'm noticing on it is very much doing E flat minor at the end of that. We've gone from the E flat being a leading tone to the E flat being a tonic of a minor scale.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is also like the melody we've had in the beginning, following a mostly third movement. There's a little bit of like seconds in there, but again, this melody is largely based around thirds.
Yeah, and this part is sort of backwards from the beginning rather than going up thirds and then up a step. It's going down a step and then down two thirds.
Yeah, and if the beginning was all about coming up and rising and developing, this is almost, if we're thinking about Otello's emotions, his emotions are driving down, darker, deeper, scarier.
Almost sounds determined right there too. It's kind of landing very solidly on that E flat.
Absolutely. And we also, I want to point out, have this repeating motive of the bum, bum, bum happening
Mhm.
before each of these phrases. You can think about these a lot of different ways, but to me, when I think about it, I almost picture they're almost like sobs.
Hmm,
And if you context it that way, it's almost like he's sobbing, and then the next phrase that it leads to has a determined ending and almost like a resolve to it.
hmm,
So you're getting these two pictures of the character dealing with themselves.
right. Well, so we have that sort of, again, what we'll call the little sobbing motif in this first phrase. And then we have it again in the very next phrase. But after that, it does something a little bit different. It doesn't just go down the way that it did before. It kind of, if that was a statement, if that was a resolution, this next one kind of feels like it's still up in the air when it's done. So let's listen to this one. It's much higher. It's not really landing any place that feels like it's done.
No, it does not feel resolved or resolute exactly, but it really feels like to me a continuation of the previous phrase that was so resolved. Like if the first phrase was, I am going to do this, then the second phrase is, oh my God, why has this happened? And almost like bemoaning it.
Hmm. And then we have a repeat of those 3 notes, and the notation for the bass is different. That's not actually marked for them to be as short. So that to me, without being a bassist, that makes me feel like those notes are supposed to be more emphasized, more kind of solid notes. They should have more momentum to them or more meaning to them.
Yeah, looking at the notation, you can really get into the weeds of it because it's often based around the edition that you're looking at because they'll do different things. But I think often how this is played live is those notes will get a lot of extra momentum, a lot of extra direction because you're going for a very big leap there, probably one of the biggest we've done in this register yet. Before in this register, everything's been largely around thirds because on a bass, the notes are very far apart. And so when you're playing this melodic material, you're often playing on one string. So you're having to move actually a lot compared to like a violin, and all the notes are just right here. Even before with what we had, the second sentimental version of the melody here. Ba, 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 da, 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 da. Even those notes, largely, you're looking at seconds
Mhm.
in that. And I think that might be what gives it some of that sweetness is it's very whole steppy and we're just connected.
Right. Very hummable, very melodic, very even almost in that spot, it's almost as if it's a like it's a lullaby even right there.
Yeah, I've studied this piece for auditions. One way I was explained how these notes work is almost you can sing the name Desdemona
Hmm.
with it. And so he's almost saying her name with these notes. But then immediately after this, you get this very directional E flat sob motive and this big leap, which is almost this last cry of sadness. And it's almost a fifth up, but it's actually one half step farther.
Yeah, this is a minor sixth leap. So it really is it's the biggest leap in the entire piece in terms of one note of the melody to the next. We've changed an octave previously, but it hasn't been one note playing and then moving to the next note. This is the first time we have a leap of a sixth in the whole piece.
And the note we're leaping to is going to it's actually the longest note of any of these other motives that we've had. They've either been quarter notes or eighth notes. This is a half note tied to an eighth note. So this is very long, which gives the bassist a lot of room to be expressive and drive it.
Right, and because it's not the perfect fifth up, it's going to feel tension to pull it back down. It's a long leap, and we've talked before on the podcast about how when you're doing a melody, if you create a long leap in the melody, it's more natural then afterwards to come back towards the direction that you leapt from, and that's exactly what's happening here. But if you are in a key, if you're on a set of notes, and you're in a chord and you leap to a note that's not in that chord, that's going to want to pull you back to wherever the closest note happens to be. It's easy to land on a note within a chord, and musically our ears hear, well, I didn't land on that note, I need to go to the nearest note. There is a musical tension just to landing on a note in the scale if it's not in that chord. And so that leap up to a flat sixth of what would be an E flat chord there has a lot of tension to it, especially because we've now got to the highest note of the entire piece. How easy is it to play this C flat way up high in the register like this on a bass?
So for this note, the way most people play it is you'll play it on one string. And so you're actually leaping about, in terms of normal distance on the instrument, about a foot
Ooh.
of space.
Also, as you get up into the higher notes, you've got less and less string and smaller distances between the positions that you put your fingers to be able to make an actual pitch in the scale. And if you're off by just a tiny little bit, this is one reason why I don't play a stringed instrument is because I just had so much trouble getting exactly in the right places to make the pitches be in tune. Where you play piano, if the piano's tuned, you can't play a note out of tune. But on stringed instruments, the non-fret stringed instruments, like the bass, you can play a note completely out of tune. You can also slide between notes, but you can be just slightly off and it's gonna sound really, really bad.
Yeah, what makes this note even a little bit trickier is because fifths, they're easier and they're harder to make in tune in a way that you know when you're correct because they will resonate and respond in a way that is very physical. So you can really know when you got it. And they're very easy notes to hear that are in tune. But since it's going to be leaping a minor sixth, this is a note that you have like, since it's a minor sixth, it needs to be perfectly in tune. But if the intonation is slightly different, maybe you're just being expressive. But it also means you don't have a foundational reference point for, oh, this is exactly what the note should be. So it makes it a little bit tricky for it to be just right.
I will point out that C flat being the same as B, it will resonate on that lowest E string. You'll have the resonance, and it's obviously gonna resonate on the other 3 strings as well at some place in those strings, because they're all gonna have resonances probably with a note that's that high up. But you are on a partial of the very lowest string on the instrument.
Yeah, and even talking about the color of the sound, we've gone from these more closed, pressed, tense notes, and then as we're leaping to this, the most emotional part of the piece, we're landing on a note where the bass will respond really well to,
Mhm.
and the sound will open up and really sing.
The physical properties of an instrument, they're so amazing, so many different instruments, so many different things to keep in mind, and Verdi knew what he was doing with this by using these particular notes. So then we have after that same figure, we've created this 3 notes and a little jump and or 3 notes and a step, that kind of repeated 3-note thing, which is now this is the 4th time we've got that 3-note pattern and that huge leap, and then we have this gradual downward process that gradually gets faster and faster until you're all 16th notes going way low again on the instrument, not all the way to the bottom of the instrument, but going very, very low, and then working your way back up. And we're ending in E flat. So we started on E and then we're ending again on E flat. Let's just play out that whole last phrase from that repeated 3-note section.
We get to this really high note and we slowly walk our way down. And then those sixteenths that we've had before in the piece we've had this bump, ba, ba, ba rhythm. And we get it a couple times almost in a row. Ba, ba, da, 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 da. And that measure turns it from a lyrical, expressive, open sound really driving the emotion to this rhythmic, pushing, almost leads us to the frustrated sounding 16th notes that rumble and grow. When you hear this live, when the basses play it, there's a certain like percussiveness to the sound that makes it honestly very frightening as a bass player to hear. It is all of these notes and tones going by very quickly that just drops and gets lower and lower and lower and murkier and darker before eventually coming out of it into these very sharp, quick, accented resolution notes.
Let's listen to just the 16th notes to the end right there just to hear what's going on with that. We're not actually even ending on E flat, we're ending on A flat. So this is the key that we've actually been in all along, A flat major, but we got there via E and E major. We are in A flat, which would be the 3rd of the E major scale. It would be the same as G sharp. So it's relational to where we started out, but it's not as if it's any kind of a a real cadential thing. It's not a standard way of going from one chord to another from where we start to where we end on this.
Yeah, and it's a little funny because we start out the beginning in A flat. The key signature is four flats, which is key signature for A flat, but we don't actually use those until now. So in a way, Verdi is almost setting this up from the beginning. I do want to talk about the 16th note pattern there and what's going on. In music, we would call this a sequence, where you
Mhm.
take the same shape of notes and basically could just bring it down to keep same shape but lower or higher. So we'd call that transposing. So ba 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 ba, and then it repeats again but just lower. Ba da 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 da.
Yep, same thing in the measure before, you've got the dun da da dun 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 da da dun dun. You've got those same patterns repeating twice in the same measure.
Yeah. So Verdi is just really bringing us to this moment through these sequences, and in a way, we are still using these E flat minor notes, but we're also modulating a bit. We start out in this first measure of the 16ths well in the E flat minor realm. And then if you look at the next measure, which is, I won't say it because it gets a little low for me. Uh, but we go from B flat, we get a G natural. And then later on in the measure, we get an F natural, a G natural again, we are changing keys slightly. The color, the tonal center is slightly changing through these fast notes.
Yeah, let's just play that one more time. I do wanna point out the C that we get, which would be the 3rd of an A flat chord, it's a C flat. So we end up in A flat minor if we're in anything because that's the notes that were played beforehand. We're not landing on a chord, we're landing on an A flat, but we've kind of been led back to a minor chord again too. And we're a long way away from where we started. So in this case, the melody doesn't start in one place and then draw itself back to that same place. The melody has ended up someplace very different than where it started.
Yeah, and even now that you mentioned that we're going to A flat minor, this whole measure is actually really important to make the ending make sense. If Verdi was to keep the same E flat minor notes we've been having, if we were to use all those notes and keep it in the measure, not change anything else, but just the accidentals, then we were to land on the bum, 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 it wouldn't necessarily make sense because we wouldn't have set it up.
Right.
So we have here, he's almost throwing in like an A flat harmonic minor, which is basically just raising certain notes in the scale when you go a certain direction. So that's where the F natural and the G natural would be. That tricks our ears into making it sound more A flat E. So that when we land on the A flat, our ears are like, ah, yes, okay, I heard that before.
Yeah. Well, and it also then leads us back to what was kind of this leading tone. It started as a D sharp, turned into an E flat, but then has been repeated now with those repeated eighth notes, those three eighth note patterns in the past. It's been repeated 12 times on fast notes. Like E flat is solidly presented for something like 12 measures beforehand as a solid note. So when we get to the A flat, it's very much a cadential thing there that it's gone from E flat up to A flat. It's like this has now reached a spot where there's some resolution. And again, not knowing exactly what's happening on the stage at this moment, something has resolved, something has happened. What's going on exactly in the scene? I'm going to use my imagination. I still think Desdemona's okay right now, so far.
Actually, you'd be correct. The funny thing about this sounds very final, sounds like a big resolution. But immediately after this, not listed in this score, is there's a immediate fake out that Verdi gives with the woodwinds. It's almost cartoonish in a way. It's like a very muted trumpet or something, but he fakes you out, and then Otello and Desdemona have this whole conversation. But if you're talking about the mind of Otello, I think about it as at this point with these resolution notes, Otello's mind is made up. Another thing to point out in the score is the notes. in once you get to the 16ths, they are staccato, but they're also marked as a little more marcato. So more marked, more concise, more direct in their approach. And it crescendos all the way through. And a common playing practice, even though not necessarily written in the score, is that basses will actually accelerando. They'll go faster
Hmm.
with it and almost build up this energy, like they're getting riled up, and just the notes get faster and faster and faster, and then become this blur of really percussive, marked, fast sound that then you get these bump, 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 really definitive notes after the end of these blindingly fast notes.
And in this whole stretch with 2 full measures of 16th notes, for that to follow, it's a completely different mood from the very beginning of the piece, where you had more than a measure of one held note, more than a whole note for those starting notes. So, yeah, this is practically a frenzy musically, just looking at the notes, not even knowing what's going on in the story. It's completely dividing up those notes into as small as we can divide them up in the speed of notes that we've got so far. And then, yeah, to accelerate it, it's a lot of tension happening right there in the music.
Yeah, the whole piece so far has been about expansiveness and even taking some time for phrasing. Like before, we had the Morendo dying away sound. You might take a little bit of time in there and really kind of drag it out slightly. But here it's the exact opposite. You are wanting to push fast and really drive almost the adrenaline of the audience up as you go to finish the solo.
Well, now all of our listeners have to watch Otello to find out what happens.
Yes. Yes.
Anything else to say on this melody before we move on? I mean, it's just it's really interesting to look at a piece of music that is kind of like underscoring before there was film underscoring, because we've done a lot of film score stuff, but we hadn't done anything that was essentially the emotional music behind something that is happening in a stage production.
Yeah, it's very interesting to compare this with modern film music because it does the exact same job. And I think it's interesting nowadays where bass playing is getting to a point where this kind of music takes a lot of effort to prepare, but the skill and technology of bass players has expanded so much that this takes effort to prepare, but it's also not necessarily that difficult. So it makes you wonder what other kind of solos we can write nowadays that take the bass's unique color and unique physical mechanics that could be written.
Well, I know for a fact we're going to be listening to some bass music in the next section after we take a break. So let's go ahead and take a break and come back, and we'll be talking about what's going on with you.
Great.
Welcome back to the Melodology Podcast, celebrating the unsung excellence of melody makers. I am your host, Arthur Breur. I am here today with composer and bassist Caeden Brusett. And right now we're going to be talking about your composing. So, what have you brought for show and tell, Caden?
So today I brought a piece for solo bass that I composed that well, it was originally for my grandfather's memorial service. And I composed it while I was at a workshop in Canada, Domaine Forget. And it effectively has three parts and kind of goes from a slight motivic melodic section into a more chordal atmospheric section, and then sort of returns back to the melodic material from the beginning, but with more intensity.
Right. And this is called Domain.
Yeah, it's called Domain in reference to where I wrote it, and except I swapped it from being in the French. I thought it was too much on the nose.
So, this is Domain by Caden Brusett. Mm. Just thinking of that in terms of a memorial piece, it starts out very poignant and very emotional, and to me, it ends almost with echoes.
Yeah, that's an interesting way to think about it. I originally, when I played this piece and was developing it, I was so nervous that my hand was sort of shaking. We call it shaky bow in the bass. But I realized how much I actually appreciated that sound. To me, I've thought about it as almost like a rasping, rattling breath
Mm.
that is beginning to just fade away. And at the end of the piece, we actually toy with using both stopped strings, so I'm playing a note fully down on the bass, and then using harmonics, those partials and fractions of the string that we were talking about before.
That's the part where you have the low notes, but at the same time, you have these kind of high, light sounds at the same time.
Yeah, so I'm actually playing on two strings at the same time and having them both speak. And I actually use that multiple times in the piece, the distance between those two notes. It's a technique for bass where you can play, well, for any instrument, where you can play notes that are much, much lower in frequency with notes that are much higher very quickly. For
Mm.
bass, it's especially effective because we have to go over such distances. Like our, for a violin to reach, a low note to a high note is like maybe 8 inches. For a bass, it's like 2.5 feet.
Mm.
So it's really hard to do those quickly. So harmonics are a way where I can play with multiple ranges at the same time. And it's a way of coloring the different motives that I've had in the piece and developing them in a different way. And it adds a sort of glistening AC quality
Mm.
that you wouldn't normally have.
Yeah. Did you have any particular ideas that came along to give you the melody that is in there or any of the figures and so forth that are in the music?
Well, it's actually very funny. I knew I had to write this piece. I was going to write a piece for my grandfather's memorial service. I was at camp for my workshop, and I almost didn't write it. I gave up. I had spent 2 days just woodshedding it, just trying to play stuff on the bass and see what sounded good, what sounded right, and I was getting absolutely nowhere. And so I actually gave up. I said, "Okay, I'm just gonna play something else." And I had this funny thing happened where all of the pressure that I had put on myself to write the piece suddenly vanished. And so the next day when I was just messing around, all of a sudden the piece just almost fell on me all at once, where I was just messing around in a section of the bass with notes that I'm very, very familiar with. It's just an octave D for us. It's really easy to find because of how the bass is constructed. You can just put your finger down and it lands on that note. And then I was just noodling around and I was like, oh, that sounds cool. And then just improvised through the first beginning. It was all by ear, really. Noticeably, there's a lot of slides in the piece. It's not a very clean piece of music. And that is absolutely intentional. I felt like the slides felt more connected and I could mess around more with the different colors that you can make with it. When a note is clean and together, it becomes noticeable. I have had people talk to me about, they ask if it's in D Phrygian. That's a mode that's kind of gets deeper into the weeds of music theory, but you know, and normally we think about major and minor, but there's actually what, 5, 6,
Bunches.
but more options when you get into the weeds of it, and so it wasn't intentionally what I was thinking about, but I ended up writing something that was had a Phrygian color to it, where it's D minor, it goes D to F natural and G, and there's a B flat in there as well, as you get to it, but the main melody goes to an E flat, which is not normally in the key of D minor. And so it
Right.
provides this. more tense color to it.
The other piece that you brought is a departure from this one. Tell us about this piece.
So this piece I composed for flute, viola, bassoon, and cello. I had spent some time composing for bass and was really trying to expand my familiarity with other instruments. And I wanted to write a quartet, but I really did not want to write a quartet for string quartet because everyone and their mother has written one. And so I was trying to think of something that had less standard implications. Because when you hear a string quartet, you're going to go, oh, okay, it's going to sound like this. You're going to have these qualities to it. And so I wanted something a little more interesting to me. And so I decided to pick through those instruments. And I was thinking, I I was thinking of people that I knew at when I was studying at school that I knew could be willing to help me out and play this piece for me. So I knew a flautist, I knew a violist, and I knew a cellist. And so I thought, I really enjoy viola. I like cello a lot. Those can be complementary. And then flute, I know who they are and I know the person who would play it. And also, I think the sound could work very well registerly because that would replace then the first violin. And then bassoon, I love bassoon so much. It is one of my favorite instruments, and it also has a very wide range and lots of beautiful
Mhm.
colors it can make. So I thought bassoon would then pair off very well with the flute. So you can have two strings and two winds being able to play off each other. And then from there, as I composed it, still considering the number of quartets that have been written and how many expectations there are with them, to almost similarly avoid the stress and the pressure of having to write something that is good, I went very reductive and was thinking, okay, what are the simplest basic building blocks of what makes a quartet work? And then compose them from there. So I studied some Beethoven quartets, was like, oh, okay, there's this structure to it. And I'm just going to take this principle and apply it to this. And so it's a very simple and approachable piece of music, but I think it sounds pretty nice. And that's sort of how I approach composition in general. Is I think I'm developing my taste somewhat, but I think music does not necessarily have to be super complicated to be meaningful.
Mm.
And so it's a very simple rhythmic pattern, very simple harmonic pattern, and then it develops into a pretty friendly piece.
Does this have a title other than Quartet Number 1?
I actually titled it Quartet with air quotes, not air quotes, literal quotes next to it because I was toying with the aspect of what is a quartet, and it's not exactly a quartet. It's not what you think about a quartet being.
So you may have discovered a new standard quartet instrumentation that actually works very nicely.
Yeah, I think it worked surprisingly well. I had this idea and I thought it sounded really good with the MIDI sounds I was hearing, and I really knew the instruments well.
I'm gonna
But
interrupt really quick right there just to let people who don't know, when composers are working at a computer, there is there's a thing called MIDI, which is basically the electronic sounds that we use. They're very realistic nowadays. They very sound the sound you were listening to with the bass as we were going through the melody today, that's a synthesized MIDI sound, basically. So when we're saying MIDI, we're talking about the computer sounds that we're listening to as we're composing something before we have real people play it, which could be very different.
yeah, and that's one of the biggest challenges, to be honest, is you when you write something, you play it on the computer and you either play it on the piano or you listen to the playback of the computer using those synthesized sounds. And it can be quite jarring when you go into a first rehearsal. You already have a perception of how the music should sound, and a person is trying to figure out the music that you wrote, and it might sound very different. But in this case, I was actually very surprised at how much better it sounded. The colors of the instruments worked a lot better than even I would have expected. And even among people who listened to it, they were like, wow, that instrumentation really worked well. And it makes me interested to pursue other unique combinations of instruments for pieces in the future.
It's one of those things that I talk about a lot is the limitations that you put on yourself. And in this case, you had a creative limitation. You were doing something with instruments that were different and had different, different ranges than the usual instruments for a quartet. They have different timbres. So you've got the flute, this very airy sounding instrument. You have the bassoon, which is a very reedy, it can have a lot of different range, but it's a reed instrument. So generally it's got a little bit more of a piercing sound in a lot of ways, a little bit more of a hard edge to the sound than the flute, which you can think of as just kind of a nice, maybe a round sound on the flute. And then you have your two stringed instruments. You have your viola, which is an alto instrument, and curiously, the sound of a viola is a little bit different because the instrument's a hard instrument to be sized correctly. It's if it was really to be designed the way the other stringed instruments are made, it would be kind of too big to hold up against your body the way that you hold a violin or a viola against your body. It would be somewhere between the size of a viola and a cello. And there are instruments that are actually designed that way where you kind of stand it up like a cello and play it so it's more resonant, but it's got its own sound because the body of the instrument isn't quite the right size for the strings and the pitches that it plays.
Yeah, well, and the difference between, even considering the cello and the viola is one thing I love about the viola is since the sizing of it is so difficult, it tends to have a more woody sound
Hmm.
that I think is a little bit richer instead of quite so bright, and I just adore it. It was interesting composing this piece to hear how very different instruments might be able to sound complementary to each other. Like, what sounds on a bassoon would sound similar or related to sounds on a viola?
What is happening next with you? What are you up to going forward?
So currently, I am pursuing doing more soundtracks in my scoring. I've spent a lot of time doing classical composition, and I'm interested to see how I could take those skills into a broader genre. And apart from doing soundtracks, I'm also doing classical composition as well. I'm currently revising a bass quartet that I wrote for, and I have ideas for perhaps a string orchestra piece.
Hmm.
And I'm also still practicing bass and potentially preparing for auditions here in Portland, as well as in the next coming years, potentially going to grad school.
Going to grad school on composition?
Composition or bass, we'll see. But in both, I'm very interested in studying in Amsterdam.
Oh, okay. So what specifically is in Amsterdam for studying?
The Amsterdam Conservatory is, I have met people who have studied there and I've heard great things about it, and it's be a wonderful experience to study there and learn from those great musicians.
And it's in Amsterdam, which is just
And
amazing.
and it's in Amsterdam. So, but we'll see. My current future is to be focused on developing some soundtrack chops and some scoring. I'm currently developing my brand, Arcane Compositions, and making more moves with that. as well as potentially reaching out to some local orchestras to see if they'd be interested in some new orchestral pieces.
I am sure they will be. I think you can definitely get that. And this falls into my experience working with community orchestras. When you approach community orchestras, if you're bringing them music that they can play, that they can feel proud of, that they can enjoy performing, then they are very often eager to play the music. There's a definite difference between orchestras and concert bands. Orchestras are a little bit more challenging to get to play new music because orchestras, especially community orchestras, they kind of are locked into playing the golden oldies, everybody's favorite. They want to have the pieces that everybody knows. And a lot of times they're also scared of new music because they don't know if they're necessarily playing it correctly. They don't know necessarily how it's supposed to sound because it doesn't always sound like music that they're familiar with and then they know. Concert bands love new music and will play new music at the drop of a hat. You bring them new music, they will just grab it, eat it up, and perform it. And that's kind of a little bit of a cultural difference. But having worked with community orchestras and with volunteer orchestras, if you bring them music that they will enjoy playing and that they think their audience will enjoy, they very often will eat it up because as a little community orchestra, they don't get to do premieres and things like that often. So you've already answered one question, Arcane Compositions. So arcanecompositions.com.
Yeah, that's it.
And and how can people find you in social media?
You can find me at Arcane Compositions on Instagram, as well as Caeden Brusett on Instagram as well, or on Facebook.
And Caden is spelled Caeden, and Brusett is one S and two T's.
That is right. Brusett.
All right.
Thanks so much for having me.
Absolutely. And my name is Arthur Breur. My last name is spelled with 5 letters, and the last 3 look like the beginning of the word Europe. So Breur. I'm Arthur Breur on all the social media. The podcast is Melody Podcast on the social media and on Patreon. And the website is melodologypodcast.com. Thank you again, Caden. It's been delightful having you on and such a fun departure going to opera music that isn't actually sung opera music as our first foray into doing an opera tune on the podcast.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. And I look forward to seeing more episodes in the future.
Thank you. This has been the Melodology Podcast, celebrating the unsung excellence of melody makers. We look forward to you coming back for the next episode.